everyone. We'll get started. My name is Dr. Emily Anhalt. I am a clinical psychologist and the co-founder and chief clinical officer for BEAM, a gym for the mind. Today we're talking about understanding and working through imposter syndrome. So it probably makes sense to start to figure out what is imposter syndrome. The term imposter syndrome was coined by two female psychologists in 1978, and here's the definition they give. Imposter syndrome is a feeling of phoniness in people who believe that they are not intelligent, capable, or creative despite evidence of high achievement. And while they are highly motivated to achieve, they live in fear of being exposed or found out as frauds. Here are some of the symptoms and signs. Negative self-talk, shying away from attention or recognition, not going after promotions, anxiety and self-doubt, a fear of being exposed or found out, and the tendency to attribute the successes that you find yourself in out and the failures that you face in. In other words, imposter syndrome is the fear that I have no idea what I'm doing and everybody's going to find out. So knowing that definition and those symptoms and signs, raise your hand if you have felt imposter syndrome at some point in your life. Wonderful. I think most of us have. Raise your hand if you've felt it, let's say, in the last month. Okay. And raise your hand if you've felt it since you arrived at this conference. All right. There's some really high-achieving people here, so that makes sense. So one of the ways I position imposter syndrome is that it's kind of like the opposite of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the idea that people who are not very competent at something are going to be more likely to rate themselves positively in that area because they don't fully understand the scope of the problem. It's a little like the idea that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. The less you know, the less you realize how much you don't know. So imposter syndrome is the opposite of that. You do know a lot, but you worry that you don't know as much as people think you do. In a way, imposter syndrome points to a willingness to see reality a little bit more fully. I'm going to ask you all another question. Raise your hand if you're a pretty good writer. Writing comes naturally to you. You can crank out a blog post, something like that. Okay, go ahead and put your hands down. For those of you who didn't put your hands up, now put your hands up if being naturally good at writing would be a huge asset to you in your work or personal life. Okay, so my curiosity would be for those people who put their hands up first, do you have a sense of how valuable this trait is? Because so often when something comes naturally to us, we assume it must not be that valuable. And so when people value it, when they recognize it, when they want to pay us for it, we think we must be tricking them somehow because it didn't feel like that much work for us to be able to do it. That's imposter syndrome. I want to talk, though, about the deeper side of imposter syndrome, because I think imposter syndrome is one of the ways we manifest our deepest insecurities, and there are all kinds of things that can live underneath the surface. I'm going to start with the idea of the internal-external mismatch. Starting from a young age, we develop an internal voice. And for all kinds of reasons, that internal voice can be really harsh and critical. These early feelings of inadequacy are stored in the limbic brain, and we unconsciously reinforce them throughout our life. So the young person who doesn't believe that they are competent or worthy of love and recognition, they will, without even realize they're doing it, attract people into their life that make them feel like they are not worthy of love and recognition. It's paradoxical, but we're comfortable and familiar with our suffering. And it's actually quite a lot to ask someone to let go of something that's been true for them since they were young. So when we get older, with this internal voice, and all of a sudden we're presented with this evidence of success from the outside. Let's say your boss comes to you and says, you know, there's a promotion that's up for grabs, and I think you should put your name in for it. What you're hearing from the outside doesn't match what you feel about yourself on the inside. And that mismatch is actually quite unsettling. And so one of the ways that we deal with that, one of the ways we try to right that mismatch, is we convince ourselves that we're imposters, that we have tricked people into thinking we're great, that they don't know the truth, we're actually awful. That's imposter syndrome. Another important concept is survivor guilt. Survivor guilt is a term that was used originally to describe when there's some kind of major disaster that some people live through and some people don't live through. This is the guilt that the survivors feel because they wonder, well, why me? Why did I make it and other people didn't make it? But these days in psychology, survivor guilt is used to describe any time a person feels uncomfortable or guilty about surviving or thriving in ways that people they love haven't been able to survive or thrive. So I'll give you the example of a patient I have who has a twin sister. And in midlife, her twin sister was in an accident that caused her to have a disability that kept her from being able to go after some of her goals and some of her dreams. My patient suddenly felt immense guilt whenever she tried to go after her goals and her dreams. It didn't feel fair that she could so easily do what she wanted to do when someone she loved so much wasn't able to. That's survivor guilt. Another example is I have a patient who a number of years ago I was working with who was a first-generation American. His parents had sacrificed a lot so that he could come to this country and succeed. And he did succeed. He was wildly successful, but it was extremely conflicting to him. It didn't seem fair that his success was coming to him so easily when his parents had given up everything for him. This is survivor guilt. Now, of course, it's not our job to keep ourselves small to prevent the people we love from feeling uncomfortable, but it's part of the human condition that we do this. We worry that our success can hurt the people we love or can leave them behind, and so we find ways of minimizing that success. Now, I'm sure we're all comfortable with the idea that people have fear of failure, but what about our fear of success? It's kind of paradoxical. We're all striving toward this thing we're actually sort of terrified of. One way to think about it is that fear of success is just fear of failure on a bigger platform. There's farther to fall. But actually, it would seem like all we want is success, but actually there tends to be a part of us that isn't so sure. I have a friend who works at a startup, and she's been at this startup for 5 years. She loves working there. She and her colleagues get along really well. They have lunch together every day. She gets to wear a lot of different hats at the company. And recently, it's become clear and public that they're likely to get acquired. So I was talking to her about this. I said, "How does it feel? This thing you've been working toward for 5 years, it looks like it's going to happen." And she said, "I don't know. I know I should just be excited, but I know when we get acquired and we're folded into this company, I'm not going to have lunch with my colleagues every day, and I'm probably not going to get to wear a bunch of different hats at my company, and everything's going to change, and I'm not sure I want it. And I've found myself working less hard recently, and I think that's why." So these are the ways that there's always a part of us that isn't so sure. Nothing's black or white. Even the things that seem all good have some aspect of conflicting feelings that can live underneath them. When it comes to imposter syndrome, it's so important to take cultural factors into account because it's not a coincidence that imposter syndrome is more common in women and people of color. When a society tells a group of people that they're less than, when they're underrepresented in C-level positions, and when they're underrepresented in the media, and when they're paid less for equal work, they're going to get the impression that they're not as worthy of this success as their counterparts. We have to acknowledge this. So let's zoom out and see how this all kind of feeds into itself. You're shown some level of new success. This stirs up some feelings inside: guilt, ambivalence, insecurity, and doubt. Suddenly what you feel on the inside doesn't match what you're being told on the outside. This is uncomfortable, and so you right this imbalance by convincing yourself that you're just fooling everyone and they don't see the truth. And so as humans tend to do, you might change behavior to match how you feel. So maybe you don't put your name in the ring for that promotion, thus sabotaging your chance of achieving that success because the feelings that it stirred up are so uncomfortable that you'd rather give it up than have to deal with those feelings. Part of what gives imposter syndrome its power, too, is that we don't always realize that we're not alone in feeling it. It's actually a very common thing to feel imposter syndrome. Some of the best people in the world in their fields have spoken about feeling like an imposter. Everyone from Sheryl Sandberg to David Bowie to Serena Williams have talked about feeling like a fraud sometimes. So let's talk about 11 ways that you might confront your own imposter syndrome. I want to say there's a reason I didn't name this talk Conquering Your Imposter Syndrome, because we don't ever really completely overcome these things, but we do have the opportunity to change our relationship to them a bit. And so I'm going to give you a couple thoughts I have about how you can arm yourself to just start the process at least. The first one is talk about it. When we put our private, messy thoughts into words, we change the actual chemistry of those thoughts. We change our relationship to those thoughts. I don't know if you've ever had a ton of things that you needed to do, and they were all swirling around in your mind, and they felt really intense and like you'd never get it all done, and then you wrote it all out into a to-do list and looked at it and thought, oh, okay, that's not so bad, I can do that. The same is true of our critical, harsh internal voice. By saying something out loud, you create a little bit of space for yourself to think, is that really true? Is that really what people think about me? It's a really powerful thing. By talking to someone else too, you give them an opportunity to show you you're not alone, and also for them to offer you a different data point, a different perspective. So if you say to your colleague, you know, sometimes I just feel like I'm terrible at my job, they can say, really? I see you every day just crushing meetings and doing amazing things. That's so interesting. I think you're great at your job. Talking about it also gives us a chance to, okay, my slides are out of order, but we're just going to roll with it. Let's play a game. It's called If You Really Knew Me. The way If You Really Knew Me works is it's about getting our guards down a little bit, allowing ourselves to be a little bit vulnerable with each other, because this topic is a little bit vulnerable. And so in a way, this is one way that we can talk about it. How this works is you're going to turn to whoever's next to you, you're going to introduce yourself, and you're going to say, if you really knew me, you would know that, and you're going to finish that sentence however you might. I'd invite you to be as open and vulnerable as you feel comfortable being in this setting. And you're going to do it 3 times in a row. If you really knew me, you would know that. If you really knew me, you'd know that. If you really knew me, you know that, sharing a different thing each time. And then the other person is going to go. So if I were doing it, it would sound something like this. If you really knew me, you would know that my sister and I didn't get along growing up, but now she's my best friend. If you really knew me, you would know that my biggest fear in the world is loss, and I do a lot to try to avoid it. If you really knew me, you would know that deep down in my heart, I feel like in a past life I lived in the ancient Egypt pyramids. So those are my 3. Go ahead and turn to your partner, share 3, and then the other person will go. All right. Go ahead and start to bring it back. All right, everyone, I'm going to bring you back to me. Thank you all for sharing with each other. The reason I think this can be powerful is that I'm asking you to think about really vulnerable things. And so being vulnerable with another person, I think, makes us feel a little bit less alone in our vulnerability. So thank you for sharing. So part of the power of talking about imposter syndrome is that it also gives you a chance to seek understanding about it. Because everyone is going to have a slightly different relationship to imposter syndrome. We each have our own unique breed of imposter syndrome. And the more you know about yours, the better equipped you're going to be to handle it. So I had a patient a while back who had raging imposter syndrome. And we decided to do an experiment. We had him write down every time he felt it, what situation he was in, what it was like for him. And we looked at it together after a while, and very quickly a pattern emerged. It became very clear that he feels his imposter syndrome the most when he's praised, especially when he's praised in public at work. And when we dug underneath it a little bit together, we realized that he was never praised as a kid. The people who were supposed to say good things about him didn't. And so he went through his life kind of pushing away praise, feeling pretty uncomfortable with it. And now in this job, when he was getting quite praised because he was doing a great job, he didn't believe them. The way he righted that mismatch was convincing himself that people were BSing him, that they were just doing it because they thought they were supposed to, that it wasn't real. When he said that out loud to me, he said, now that I say that out loud, that sounds kind of silly. Like, my boss doesn't owe me anything. Why would he praise me in public for no reason? Now, this realization didn't instantly remove all of his imposter syndrome, but it did create that little bit of space where the next time he was praised and that feeling came up, he could think to himself, wait, this might be the imposter syndrome. This might not be real. And he was able to slowly start to change his relationship to that feeling. So think about your imposter syndrome. With whom do you feel it the most? What situations? When does it come up? What does it feel like in your body? What does it sound like in your mind? My third tip is avoid comparisons. We tend to compare ourselves to everyone. In this day and age of social media, this is happening like crazy. One thing I like to say is, don't compare your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. That Instagram picture that your friend posted that makes her life look really clean and tidy and adventurous and beautiful and perfect and her relationship has never seen a problem in its life, no way. And yet you're comparing that to your messy life that you're privy to because it's your life. And we can feel like we're so far behind because we think that all of the things happening for us aren't happening for other people. I can tell you they are. So I want to share a time that a comparison has really gotten in my way. I went to a yoga class. I'm not very good at yoga, but I wanted to practice. And so I went to a class, and I parked myself in the middle of the class. And in front of me sits this beautiful, flexible, amazing yogi goddess of a woman. And for the whole class, she's just doing all of the complicated poses, doing an amazing job, and I'm just watching her out of the corner of my eye the entire time, thinking, this woman is so much better than me, I'm never gonna be this good at yoga, I shouldn't even be here, I don't belong in this class. And at the end of the class, I reflected back on all of those thoughts, and I realized I had completely missed the whole point of the class. I had gone there to connect with my mind and my body. And instead, the entire time I was concerned about this other woman. So not only had I missed the point of the class, I had also cheated myself out of an opportunity to become more like her. If I had focused on myself in that class, I would have gotten a little bit better at yoga that day. But I didn't get any better at yoga that day because I spent the whole time feeling bad about myself because I wasn't this other woman. So by comparing ourselves to other people, instead of trying to move toward the version of ourself that we're most excited about, it's a lot harder to get to where we're trying to go. My fourth tip is stop shitting all over yourself. I should be more successful. I should be smarter. I should be more like so-and-so. I should have accomplished whatever by now. When we should all over ourselves, we put ourselves in a fixed mindset instead of a growth mindset. Because when we feel like we should have already accomplished something, it makes us feel like we're not capable of accomplishing it right now. So stop shitting all over yourself, as difficult as it can be. My experience is that the people who use should a lot tend to have really harsh internal voices. One of my favorite quotes of all time is by Maya Angelou. She said, "Forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it. Forgive yourself for not being who you couldn't have been before you became it. It's okay not to have gotten everywhere you want to have gotten yet. If you had, then what would be the point of moving forward? So instead, start with what you could do instead of what you should have done." Number 5 is keep a self-esteem file. Imposter syndrome has a selective memory. We tend to ruminate over and over and over on negative feedback and let positive feedback just kind of fly right by us. A self-esteem file means that every time you get a great piece of feedback from your boss, from your spouse, anytime you're really proud of yourself from something, write it down, screenshot it, put it in a folder on your computer, put it in a box on your desk, whatever it might be. And then when you're feeling like an imposter, go through that file and remind yourself that that tricky imposter voice that tells you that you're nothing but bad is not seeing the whole picture. I want you all to start this right now. Pull out your phone or a piece of paper and a pen and write down the best piece of feedback you have ever received. What has someone told you that just really stuck with you? It meant something to you. You were able to take it into yourself. Go ahead and write it down, type it out, screenshot it, and then from now on, whenever you get good things coming to you, add to it. Let this folder grow so that when you're feeling not so great, you can look at it and see that not only do other people see your value, but past versions of you see your value. And so maybe what you're feeling right now isn't the whole picture. Go ahead, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write that down. Those of you who are still working, continue to be working, but may I have one brave and courageous soul who might be willing to share their amazing piece of feedback for everyone to hear? Yes, thank you.
Somebody told me I'm a force on stage.
Nice. That must have felt great to hear. Fantastic. One other person want to share? Yes, thank you.
Somebody asked me why I worked at the company because I was so obviously above the rest of them.
That's amazing. I love that. Maybe they have some imposter syndrome about the company too. That's fantastic. So thank you both for sharing. The reason I wanted you to share is that I feel like we're really subtly discouraged from being outwardly proud of ourselves in this culture, which I think is a problem. We're allowed to insult ourselves all day long, but as soon as we say, you know what I'm really proud of myself for? This thing that someone told me, it's discouraged. I think that's a shame. All right, so number 6 is get comfortable saying, I don't know. Have you ever heard an expert asked a question and they clearly don't know the answer, but they just kind of ramble on trying to get an answer to it and it sounds really silly, versus an expert who's asked a question and they say, what an important question. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to look into that and get back to you. Not knowing everything is not the same thing as being an imposter. Making mistakes and having gaps in your knowledge are not the same as being an imposter. It's so important to internalize this because when you don't, here's what happens. Your fear of being seen as an imposter causes you to hide your mistakes and your gaps in knowledge. And because you're trying to hide that, you don't ask questions, you don't seek support, you don't go fill those gaps in knowledge. By doing that, you're sabotaging your chance to become more competent at that thing. And when we know we're not doing everything we could to be the best that we could possibly be, we start to feel more like an imposter, which increases our fear of being seen as an imposter, and it starts the cycle again. So nobody knows everything about anything. Get more comfortable saying, I don't know. Number 7 is focus on providing value. There is no quicker way to feel like less of a fraud than to genuinely help someone else. They did a giant research study about group therapy and what makes group therapy feel useful to people. They asked people, what was it about the group therapy that helped so much? And people said things like, the therapist said something useful, or the structure of seeing the same people every week was nice. But overwhelmingly, the top answer, independently given by the most number of people, is group therapy felt the best to me when I felt like I was genuinely making a difference for someone else. Human beings want to feel important. It's important to us that we feel that we're making some kind of difference in other people's lives. We're social creatures in that way. So the next time you're feeling low, figure out what it is you're really good at and go do it for someone. Volunteer or offer your team some help, whatever it might be. Not only will you help them, but it'll help you with your own feelings. All right, number 8 is such an important one, but also a really tough one. Practice accepting compliments. We are really bad at accepting compliments. What's the first thing people usually do when they're given a compliment? They immediately tell the person why they're wrong about that compliment. Someone says, wow, you did such a great job in that presentation. And you go, oh, no, I messed up like 5 times. Why do we do that? I think because compliments are uncomfortable. The other thing we do to avoid the feeling of that discomfort of the compliment is we immediately throw a compliment right back in the other person's face. Someone says, you look really nice today. And you say, you look nice today. Before you even feel this thing that they had chosen to share with you. It is so important that we let people's affirmations find a place in us. A compliment is a gift. It should be accepted as such. I have a friend named Evan. He's really good at accepting compliments. I'll say something to him like, wow, Evan, that was so helpful what you just told me. I feel like it's just totally blew my mind. You're great at this. And he'll go like this. He'll go, thank you. Now that sounds silly, but it makes me feel great. I feel like, wow, he really took that compliment. He folded it into his identity. I made a difference for him just now by noticing him, by seeing him. So not only did it feel good for me as the giver, but I imagine it felt good for him that he let himself have that compliment. He didn't feel like he had to swat it away or negate it with some reason why I was wrong. So I see there being 3 levels to accepting a compliment. The first is don't immediately tell them they're wrong or give a compliment right back. The second is let it land on you physically, really feel it before you feel like you have to respond. And the third one is a tough one. The third one is ask for more. When we're given negative feedback, the first thing we usually do is say, can you give me some examples? Can you help me understand why you're saying this to me right now? But we don't do that with positive feedback, and I think we should. The next time someone says, great job in that meeting, say, thank you. What was it about what I did in the meeting that really felt good to you? What could I be doing continually that was great, right? It's okay to solicit the kind of feedback that we need to hear. Number 9 is don't personalize professional criticism. These days, especially in tech, our work and our personal lives feel like they're one and the same. But when your boss tells you, hey, this project is not adequate, it's not the same as them saying, you are not adequate, even though it can often feel that way. I think it's really important to have some sense of agency and hobbies and relationships outside of work so that when things are shaky in one part of your life, it doesn't feel like it's completely rocking the foundation of your entire identity. Number 10 is get over yourself. By this I mean give other people a little credit. Is it really more likely that you're bad at what you do for a living but good at tricking everyone around you than it is that your superiors are seeing something wonderful in you? By feeling like you're easily fooling everyone around you, you're saying that people around you are that easily fooled. I imagine there are people who evaluate you who you respect. And if that's the case, do you really feel like you're such a trickster that they're not seeing the real you? It tends to be unlikely. I love this tweet by Mina Markham. She's a senior engineer at Slack. She said, every time I start falling prey to a bout of imposter syndrome, I remind myself that I'm not a good enough actress to fool an entire industry. None of you are good enough actors and actresses to fool everyone in your life. So give them a little credit and give yourself a little credit. Finally, fake it till you make it. Now, I know this sounds a little like I'm telling you to be more of an imposter in order not to feel like an imposter, but the truth is sometimes we have to say to ourselves, I am good, I am capable, I am worthy, even when we don't totally feel it. Because the things we tell ourselves become our reality. I want to give you an example of a time I did this for myself. A number of years ago, I read an article about how women tend to use the word just in their email communications a lot more than men do. They'll say things like, hey, just wanted to add this one idea, or just checking in, or just making sure we're still on for that meeting. And the article was talking about how this is a woman's way of undercutting herself and not having conviction in her place in a conversation. So this really resonated with me. I'd never thought of that before, but I knew that I used the word just all the time. And so what I did after I read that article is I decided to make a promise to myself that I wasn't going to do that anymore. And whenever I was writing an email and I typed out just, I went back and I erased it. This felt really uncomfortable to do. It felt weird to say, hey, I want to add something, instead of, hey, just wanted to add this one thing. But I knew that I didn't want to be the kind of person who didn't have conviction in my ideas, so I forced myself to delete the word just over and over and over again. Until eventually, I stopped using it as much. It stopped coming out of my fingers as often. And something else even more important happened, which was that I felt proud of myself for feeling empowered and stepping into my conviction about myself. By forcing myself not to use that word, I was also taking care of myself and saying something about my mind and my ideas, which made it easier not to use the word just as much, which made it easier to believe in myself more, and on and on. So in this way, I really did fake it until I made it. The next time you see yourself undercutting yourself, take a breath and try again. You might not realize it until afterwards, but this is like a muscle. You can strengthen it over time. You can change the way you relate to yourself in this way. So for the purpose of this presentation, I went back and I did a search of all of my emails for the 3 years before I read that article and the 3 years after I read that article. For the 3 years before, I used just in 48% of my emails. And for the 3 years after, I only used it in 12%. That's a huge difference. So now that we've talked a little bit about changing your relationship to your own imposter syndrome, I want to talk a little bit about how you as a leader can support other people with their imposter syndrome. Because I'd imagine that most, if not all of you, are in positions where people are looking up to you to know how to be and how to feel. So let's go over some of those. The first one is acknowledge your own privilege. Having privilege does not make you an imposter, but it is a factor in the equation of your success. And by admitting this, by acknowledging it, you're going to help other people contextualize their own success if they have different privilege than you or if they don't have the privilege that you have. How powerful would it be if the CEO who just sold his company for $1 billion got on the microphone and said, you know, I worked really hard for this, but I was also born into a fairly well-to-do family, and my parents gave me my first investment, which made it a lot easier for me to start this company. It'd be pretty powerful, and we don't do that enough. So just by acknowledging your own privilege, you're doing service to people who come after you. The next suggestion is be transparent about your own struggles and your own gaps in knowledge. It's a powerful thing to see someone you respect say, you know, this is really not my strong suit, but I'm working on it, and here's what I'm doing to work on it. It makes it feel like it's more okay to fail for other people. Next is reward teaching, mentoring, and learning. They've shown that teams that reward people going out and getting more education and who ask questions to their bosses, they've shown that teams that encourage that and reward that are more successful as teams. When someone comes to you and asks you a question, give them props for being willing to take that risk of admitting that they don't know. Discourage comparisons and try to avoid using them yourself. I know this is hard in some parts of a company, like sales, for example, but no one wants to hear their parents say, why can't you be more like your sister? And no one wants to hear their boss say, John did it in 2 weeks, why can't you do it in 2 weeks? Right? Try to encourage people to compete against themselves versus other people. Next is use the chair effect. The chair effect is the idea that when someone comes to you asking for a solution to a problem, you first have them talk through the problem to an empty chair. So often they'll get to the solution themselves. And the reason that's important is that it empowers them to realize that they had the knowledge they needed inside the entire time. Of course, if they still need your help, give it to them, but it's a powerful thing to show someone that they might not have needed the support because they had what they needed all along. Finally, give constructive feedback. Your language is really important. There's a big difference between saying, you're not where I need you to be right now, versus your work isn't where I need it to be right now. If you're going to give someone feedback, give them examples, help them understand what it is that they could do differently. And this is true with positive feedback too. Instead of saying, hey, great job today, say, hey, when you said X, it made a big difference for this reason, and I appreciate it because of Y. Right? Give examples, help people really feel it. So if imposter syndrome is the worry that we're not as competent as other people think we are, maybe we need to change the definition of competence. Maybe competence should really mean embodying a healthy balance between empowerment and humility. The ability to have conviction about yourself and know that there's still always more to learn. So I want to leave you with 5 things that you could do by the end of this week to kickstart your own journey of processing your imposter syndrome. The first one is reflect on your own imposter fears. When do you feel it? Why? Who is it with? What's it feel like in your body? All of that. Write that down and see if there's any kind of pattern. The second is reflect someone's value to them. Reach out to someone and let them know what you see in them, what's powerful about them, what inspires you about them. It'll make their day, and it'll make you feel good to have made their day. Third is play if you really knew me with a friend. It is pretty amazing how much closer we can feel with someone as soon as we've shared new things about ourselves with them. There are a lot of relationships between 2 people that have lasted for years and they've never actually talked about anything super deep or personal. It's amazing. So spark this up with a colleague or a friend, whatever it might be. I can tell you from years of playing this game that whoever you're playing with will match your vulnerability for the most part. So if you share vulnerable things, they're more likely to share vulnerable things. Next is write down 3 things that you're really great at and add them to your self-esteem file. Don't forget to add to that yourself, because even more powerful than seeing other people's positive views of you is seeing your own positive views of you that were written down in a different state of mind. They help us realize that the voice we're currently feeling isn't the only one. And then finally, go out and solicit some positive feedback. Reach out to someone you respect and say, hey, I'm working on empowerment and seeing my own value. Can you reflect some of that to me? What are some of the things you see in me that are really powerful? My digital door is always open to talk about this, but I have about 5 minutes, so does anyone have any questions?
Go back to the one about competence.
About competence. Yeah. Anyone have any questions for me? Yeah.
Can you go to your last slide again so we can see your website one more time?
Yes. Are we good with this one? Cool. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So when you're a leader in an organization,
Uh-huh.
Does it ever backfire to like be too vulnerable or too open about where your gaps are?
Yeah, I mean, you have to find a healthy balance between humility and maintaining confidence, right? The example I sometimes give is, if the company wasn't doing very well and people came to you and they're like, hey, how are we doing? Hopefully you wouldn't say, it's all going to hell. Pack your bags, we're all gonna be homeless in 5 days. No, that's not helpful. But hopefully you wouldn't also say, we're good. I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's fine. Because people are perceptive, and when what you're saying doesn't match the truth, it's really uncomfortable. So I think it's about finding some middle ground, saying something like, I don't know right now, and that's unsettling. I wish I had better answers for you. Or when talking about your own vulnerability, saying, I'm working on a lot of stuff right now. I know this isn't the right place to share all of it, but know that you're not alone in struggling. I'm with you, we all struggle. Here's how I'm getting support outside of work, whatever it might be, right? So you don't have to dive into details and exhaust people with everything happening, but the idea that you don't have it all together can be a powerful thing to share. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, if you're within a system that kind of adds to your imposter syndrome, for example, like your place of work, how do you start a conversation, or how would you suggest starting a conversation with someone that contributes to that culture within your workplace?
How is it that they contribute?
Say, for example, you are the only, like, I guess I'll use my example, the only woman in a room full of men, pay grades are different, responsibilities are very similar. So how would you start that conversation to try to change that culture?
I think transparency is the name of the game. I think I'd suggest sitting down the person who makes those decisions and say, I think there's something here that you can't see because you're not able to see it from where I sit. And that is that as a woman, it is hard to sit in a room of men and know I'm getting paid differently for the same work and not feel like I can show up the same way. How can I support you in making this better? Right? Naming it, not feeling like we have to pretend something's not there just because we're not the ones with the power. I think it's, and I want to say that's not always possible. There's issues of safety when it comes to speaking up from a place of non-power, so it's not always so easy, but I think when we can do it, we owe it to the others in our crew to do it. Any other questions? Okay, I'll stick around. Feel free to come up and ask more questions if you'd like. Thank you all so much for having me. Take care.